Hi there. My name is Elisa Hategan. When I was 16 years old, I was recruited into Canada's most dangerous white supremacist group in modern Canadian history, the Heritage Front. At 18, I defected from the group, turned information over to police, testified against group leaders in court, and helped to shut them down. This is the story of my journey from darkness to light. I was born in the Socialist Republic of Romania during the dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu. In 1986, when I was 11 years old, my family immigrated to Toronto, Canada. My entire world changed overnight. The identity drilled in me by the communist system was gone, and I struggled to fit in a country where everyone seemed to celebrate individuality and diversity. My parents were fighting all the time. My father beat my mother and me, and my mother took it out on me. Both my parents were deaf and had had awful lives where they too had been abused and considered worthless because of their disability. When I was 13, my father returned to Romania and died soon after. My mother and I moved to a community housing building in Regent Park. I was bullied at school and hid at home, and life seemed hopeless, so at 14 years old I ran away from home and ended up in the care of the Children's Aid Society, where I spent almost 2 years. I was living in a group home on Browning Avenue when I first started feeling racist toward others. For months I'd been the only white girl there and was bullied by other residents. In retrospect, I realized that the bullying was more about the fact that I didn't know anything about pop culture. I didn't know about rap music or who Michael Jackson and Madonna were. I wore my hair in braids. I had a funny accent. Plenty of things could have made me a target, but back then I thought it was because I was the only white kid there. At 15 and a half, I ran away from a foster home and came back to live with my mother, and then I dropped out of high school. I tried to get jobs, but I was too young. One day I was watching TV and saw a young man talking about white pride. He was clean-cut, wore a suit, and didn't look like a Nazi. He was asking why whites were supposed to feel ashamed of our skin color while everybody else celebrated their heritage. The camera zoomed in on a flyer with the address of an American white nationalist organization, so I wrote to them and they sent me the phone number of an organization in Toronto called the Heritage Front. It was 1991 back then and most people weren't on the internet yet, so they had no website, but they operated a hotline where they recorded messages about whites becoming a minority and why do we celebrate Black History Month and not White European Heritage Month. After about a week, I worked up the nerve to leave a voicemail. A man called me back right away. His name was Wolfgang Droge, and he immigrated to Canada from Germany as a teenager. We met the next day in front of the Eaton Centre, the downtown shopping mall in Toronto. I was 16 and had never even gone on a date, so I was really nervous to meet a guy in his 40s. But as soon as we met, he became a mentor and a father figure to me. Wolfgang was the first person to be interested in who I was. He asked about my hobbies, my interests, my dreams for the future. I loved writing, so he told me that I should write for the Heritage Front's new magazine. Wolfgang had been a member of David Duke's Klan chapter in Louisiana, and also a member of the Order, a 1980s American white supremacist terrorist group responsible for armored truck robberies, bombings, and the murder of a Jewish radio host named Alan Berg. In 1981, Wolfgang and a group of mercenaries were arrested in a plot to take over the island of Dominica and turn part of it into a white ethno-state. Wolfgang also served time for drug possession before he moved back to Toronto and created the Heritage Front, along with a couple of other white nationalists, specifically a guy named Grant Bristow. Grant was a co-founder, he ran the security division, and also helped by throwing in money once in a while. A month after I joined, Wolfgang introduced me to Ernst Zundel, another German national who for 30 years had been the world's most notorious publisher of Holocaust denial propaganda and a friend of David Irving, who I also met. Zundel lived in a townhouse at 206 Carlton Street in Toronto, which was only a 5-10 minute walk from my mother's apartment. I became his errand girl. I folded booklets, stuffed envelopes with newsletters, and fetched him duck liver pâté from the corner store. He didn't pay me, but he fed me and I could sleep at his place whenever I had trouble at home. Wolfgang and Ernst taught me that the public doesn't want to see swastikas anymore. The white nationalist movement needed clean-cut people with no tattoos, people who speak nicely and don't use fists but words as their weapons. My biggest task was to show a young, innocent face to the media. I wrote articles for the magazine and recorded messages for the official hotline. I was trained to recruit others, to flirt with new recruits, and chat up seniors who might donate money. Within weeks, I became the Heritage Front's only female spokesperson and the softer, feminine face of the group. In December 1991, I made my first speech at a Heritage Front rally. I was still 16 years old. By the next year, I represented Canada's far right on the Montel Williams show, sitting next to John Metzger of White Aryan Resistance. Wolfgang signed my parental consent form.
And another thing you should always keep in mind, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. No one can affect your judgment if you don't let them. And sticking together as brothers is the only way to clean our country of this violent element. And if any speech, let them know that
the Heritage Front became my new family. The more I loved them, the more I hated anybody who wasn't like us. And the more I hated, the more my racist family loved me. By 1992, people were stockpiling weapons and getting ready for a race war, and I was taught to fire guns. That year, the Heritage Front started attacking the community. A group home for young girls was firebombed twice, and a black staff member was sexually assaulted. The Morgenthaler abortion clinic was firebombed, and the Heritage Front's telephone number spray-painted on the wall. After a hate rock concert, one Tamil man was beaten and paralyzed, and a Heritage Front skinhead was convicted for his assault. 2 other South Asian men were beaten to death that summer, but their killer was never caught. The Native Canadian Centre on Spadina Road, several synagogues, and a leftist bookstore were all spray-painted. A Jewish activist's home in Kitchener, Ontario was firebombed twice. That winter, our intelligence chief, Grant Bristow, launched the IT campaign, a harassment and psychological terror campaign targeting anti-racist activists. He gave skinheads the addresses and phone numbers of the specific people he wanted us to terrorize. One night, he passed me a piece of paper with the details of a woman named Ruth. He wanted me to go on sex hotlines and pretend I was her, to say that her sexual fantasy was to be raped by black men and beaten with chains, and give her address so men could go to her house. I didn't do it, but I asked him why he hated Ruth so much. He just laughed and said she's a lesbian and a leader in a group called Anti-Racist Action, and that was enough to destroy her life. He told me he was trying to get her fired and evicted so she would have a mental breakdown, and he wanted to pound her head in with a sledgehammer. Grant seemed particularly obsessed with tormenting women, so I asked him, why are we targeting women more? And he just said, women are more emotional. They're the first to break. And that's when something clicked in my head, and I started to identify with the other side, with the victims of the Heritage Front. In January 1993, Wolfgang gave me a stack of flyers Grant had created, which compared a black man with a gorilla and listed the name and address of a female member of Anti-Racist Action. I felt sorry for her and worried that she might be attacked. At that time, I was taking a night course at a local high school where 2 ARA members were in my class, so I decided to give them a copy of the flyer and ask them to warn this girl that the Heritage Front were passing these out. I didn't realize the girl would go to the police. But a week later, 2 cops showed at my door and asked me where I got the flyers. Obviously, I couldn't tell them that the leader of the Heritage Front had given them to me because I'd be considered a rat. So the police ended up charging me with libel and hate propaganda for those flyers. My charges were eventually dismissed the following year, but in that moment it felt like I would never get out of the front. I thought there was only one way out. So I took a bunch of my mother's painkillers, went to a bench at Allen Gardens, and I took them all. Some people found me, called an ambulance, and I woke up at Women's College Hospital, hooked up to an IV. They were going to hold me for 48 hours, but I convinced them that I didn't really mean to kill myself. It was an overdose. So a nurse brought me a telephone and said they would discharge me if someone could just come and pick me up. Problem was, I didn't have anybody to call. So I searched through my jacket pocket and found the note that Grant Bristow had given me, with Ruth's name and number on it. And then I called Ruth and told her that I was in the hospital and I needed to talk to her because I didn't have anybody else. She came to get me that night, and we met in secret over the next month. Ruth deconstructed my ideology and essentially deprogrammed me. It took me 3 weeks before I finally worked up the courage to tell her I was gay. That's when she laughed and told me she'd already figured it out. Then she asked me if I was ready to leave the Heritage Front. I thought about the terror that Grant had inflicted on Ruth and all the other innocent activists targeted by the IT campaign, and it didn't make sense to leave. How could I live with myself if I just walked away? I had to undo any harm I'd caused, and the best way to do that was to hit them from the inside. Ruth connected me to a man named Martin Thériault, the director of a Montreal think tank called the Canadian Centre on Racism and Prejudice. Martin double-checked all my evidence to make sure it was all legit, and for the next 4 months I turned information over to them. I signed approximately 30 affidavits that we handed over to the Ontario Provincial Police. When I was working at Ernst Zundel's townhouse, I also stole a partial list of his donors and supporters. In November 1993, Wolfgang asked me to go over to his apartment to help with the mail-outs. I had a bad gut feeling, but I couldn't say no. Right after I got there, a physically intimidating big guy named Peter showed up. Together they confronted me about spying on the Heritage Front and said that I'd been asking too many questions about Grant. They thought I was an informant and wearing a wire. Peter pushed me down in an armchair, pulled out a knife and pointed it at me, and lifted up all my clothes to look for a wire. He said, "You know what happens to rats? They end up in the sewers." Wolfgang then said, "We took care of you. We're your only family. Nobody else wants you. And the Heritage Front isn't going to be brought down by a young girl. What kind of damage you think you can do?" I kept denying everything until he finally told me, "Get the fuck out of here." So I ran home as fast as I could, grabbed a bag I'd already packed and hidden in my closet, and called a telephone number Martin Thériault had given me in case of emergencies. Within an hour, I was out of my mother's apartment and went into hiding. My affidavits exposed criminal activity and led to a discreditable conduct charge against a Toronto police officer who was charged with being on the Heritage Front membership list, buying their videotapes, and attending a KKK rally in Arkansas. They also led to the expulsion of Heritage Front members from the Reform Party, which was the main conservative party in Canada during the early 90s. This scandal contributed to the Reform Party's decline. I survived thanks to the help of activists like Martin Thériault, Ruth, Annetta, and Rodney Bobbywash from the Native Canadian Centre. At 18 years old, I was denied witness protection. The OPP officers who took my affidavits were worried about me, but said they'd been directed by their supervisor to disregard all my evidence. They couldn't even get a search warrant, even though I'd reported illegal weapons like AK-47s. A year later, I finally learned why they were ordered not to act. Canada's intelligence agency, CSIS, was running an undercover operation inside the Heritage Front, and arresting Grant Bristow would have compromised the whole thing. In March 1994, I came back to Toronto to testify at a contempt of court trial against Wolfgang and 2 other members. The courtroom was packed. They even had metal detectors at the door. I was cross-examined by Heritage Front lawyers for 3 long days, in which Wolfgang and his friends never stopped smirking or glaring at me. They accused me of making deals with police, which I never did. In June 1994, they were convicted and sentenced to jail terms, and the judge credited me specifically for their conviction. Based on the evidence of Ms. Hategan alone, I am satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendants are guilty. Despite the fact that my testimony just sent the leader of the Heritage Front and 2 other men to jail, I had no protection. But the charges against me had been dropped, and I was free to move across Canada. In August 1994, I was living in Halifax when Toronto Sun reporter Bill Dunphy called me the night before his exposé went to press to break the news that Grant Bristow was a CSIS informant, part of an undercover operation called Operation Governor. As soon as Dunphy's article hit the national headlines, Bristow entered the Witness Protection Program, despite the fact that he'd created crime rather than prevent it. Toronto Metro Police tried to question Bristow regarding his criminal activity, but CSIS provided him with a lawyer and immediately hit him out of province.
then became a victim of Bristow's harassment. Finally, she filed over 30 affidavits with the Ontario Provincial Police, detailing, among other things, Bristow's central role in Heritage Front activities. Police sources say CSIS panicked.
When Elise came out and said she was going to tell the truth, CSIS was saying they were going to go out and discredit her, because Elisa Hategan was pointing the finger at Grant Bristow. He ordered this, he masterminded that. I remember Al Tredenick was really livid over the thing. He said, "We'll tear her to shreds."
Bristow was relocated to Alberta to a 3-car garage house, given 2 SUVs and $3,000 a month for 5 years. In 2020, that would be about $4,800 a month. He never had to scrunch for food in garbage cans or worry about where he would sleep next. CSIS spent hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars paying Bristow and his handlers a salary from '89 to '94. But not one Canadian white supremacist was ever arrested and convicted as a result of Operation Governor. My testimony led to 3 prominent convictions, but I wasn't given any protection. For 2 years, I was on the run across Canada, couch surfing and dumpster diving to survive. I stayed in grungy flop houses with students and little old ladies on a rural farm in Quebec, with a Black Baptist reverend out in Nova Scotia, with American Indian Movement warriors from a reserve. And every person who took me in, who gave me shelter and a meal, taught me so much about humanity. Their kindness and generosity, their willingness to risk their own safety for me despite my past, taught me everything I know about love and forgiveness. In 1994, I was staying in a homeless women's shelter in Halifax called Addison House when I signed up to take a 2-day-long GED exam. A month later, my high school equivalency diploma arrived in the mail, and a year later I was accepted as a mature student at 2 universities, and I chose the University of Ottawa for its criminology program. I got through university with student loans, merit scholarships, and working 2 jobs. And in 1999, I graduated magna cum laude with a double major in criminology and psychology. After that, I got a job teaching English in Seoul, South Korea, and finally earned enough money to travel, something I'd always wanted to do. I spent the summer of 2001 traveling throughout Europe. Eventually, I visited Auschwitz, Poland, Hungary, and returned to Romania. My mother had cut me off from relatives on my father's side, so this was my first visit to Transylvania since I was 10. I tracked down my father's village and found my relatives, and after talking with them and going through my grandmother's things, I realized that my father had been Jewish but hid his ancestry. Certain things suddenly made sense, like how my grandmother, who died when I was 10, never mixed milk and meat and talked about Saturdays were a day of rest when she was a girl. Years later, after the technology became available, I ordered DNA kits from 23andMe and Ancestry and learned that I had thousands of Jewish cousins in their databases. The following year, I converted to Judaism. As I started connecting with Jewish relatives from Transylvania, Bukovina, Bessarabia, and Ukraine, I discovered that many of my genetic relatives actually died in the Holocaust. When people convert to Judaism, they have to write an essay that describes why they want to become Jewish. This is what I wrote in my essay. In my soul, heart, and mind, Judaism is more than a religion. It's a shared history, a genetic memory, a family, and a connection that has always been just outside the realm of my consciousness, yet was always there. My father's denial of his religion and heritage was like an invisible wall that kept me from my past. But with each day and each hour, the wall becomes increasingly transparent. The bricks fall apart, and I begin to see a glimpse of something beautiful and mystical on the other side. The shadows of those great-grandparents and the whispers of their lives come through to me and out into my very own existence. I have had thousands of Jewish ancestors from Poland, Russia, Galicia, Ukraine, and Romania, whose truth, lives, and stories have been wiped off in only 2 generations, 100 years. That is all it took to wipe out my family's connection to their own lineage and heritage. It took me a lifetime to realize that my parents were a byproduct of their time. They had suffered so greatly that they absorbed their oppression. They made others suffer because that was the only way they could relate after the pain they endured. They hurt me because they themselves had been hurt. And then I too tried to keep that flame of hate alive because I'd never known another way. But my family is only a microcosm of this world. So many scarred, wounded people have created the world we live in today, where suffering and oppression breeds brutality. In order to overcome that legacy, I had to dig deeper into my family's roots of pain. And those roots of pain go back to my deaf father, who died when I was 13. My father was a brilliant painter and art professor, but he became bitter after being bullied for many years by boys in his Transylvanian village, and after being denied opportunities to succeed as an artist by the hearing community. He was beaten by a world that doesn't listen to deaf mutes and immigrants, so he became the beater. His broken dreams turned into rage, and he took his revenge on his wife and child. He made me feel as worthless as he had felt in his life, as worthless as my own grandmother Anna had felt before him. My paternal family couldn't scrub the Romanian from their blood, the barbed wire, the Jew, from the coarseness of their hair. So they changed their name and lied about their Jewish identity, the same way I hid my identity when I came to Canada. As an immigrant with an accent, I didn't fit in. I hated my nose and my Romanian accent, being asked, "Where are you from?" everywhere I went. Every time I was asked, "Where are you from?" it was a reminder that I didn't belong here. Sometimes it's easier to become the other, the one who would otherwise break you. When you have no more skin left to grow another scab, healing becomes impossible. Sometimes it's easier not to heal, because healing or forgiveness means acknowledging that you are a victim. And for some people, this acknowledgement has the power to crush you right back into the dirt you came from. Deep inside, you know that if you face the truth of your victimization, you might never get off your knees. Sometimes it's easier to become the enemy. And that's what happened to me as a teenager, a half-Jewish girl who became a neo-Nazi. For the first time in my life, I went from powerless to powerful. I was the bully instead of the bullied. I was no longer my poor, immigrant, disabled parents' daughter, but a strong and vengeful Athena instead of the wounded girl I saw every time I looked in the mirror. On December 2nd, 2015, my mother passed away from Alzheimer's at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. She'd had a horrible life. As a child, she herded goats barefoot and slept in a barn because her own mother thought she was worthless. When she was 12 or 13, she was assaulted by village boys who thought she wouldn't tell anybody because she was a deaf mute. And after that, she got sent to an institution for deaf girls. She never got justice, and I think it destroyed her life and turned her into an abuser. So as she lay dying in my arms, I made her a promise that nobody would ever exploit us again, that I would always fight back. I decided that I would fight for truth and justice. I would fight for others who are voiceless and struggling to survive in a world where the weight of truth depends on the perceived worth of those who speak it. I would do everything I could to break this vicious cycle, a cycle where hatred and intolerance suppress the spark of divine essence, the oneness that connects all beings. I believe the future of humanity rests within us. Love is stronger than hate. Unity is stronger than division and sectarian violence. Kindness reveals so much more about courage than brutality, and we can accomplish so much more if we embraced one another as long-lost relatives. If you trace your genealogical roots far back enough, you'll return to the beginning, to that first atom, to that first cell that replicated to create the first invertebrate worm, who morphed into a fish, and then a mammal that walked on land or flew through the air like the arrows and spears thrown by the earliest humanoids, who loved and killed and bred their way across the planet as volcanoes exploded and continents formed, as plants conquered their way across jungles and oceans fractured continents, and all of this breeding and loving and killing and weeping, millions of ancestors, all the tears and loves and fears and conquests of your grandparents and parents, All these roads finally led to the amazing, unique human being that is you. If we all just traced our inception to that very first cell that connected a parent to a child, then we would understand that we are all related. We are all one family, and we are all connected, just like every oak tree that carries within itself the epigenetic memory of the acorn shell that made it, all the way back to the inception of time itself, to that first cell, to that big bang that created the universe, to that first memory of being one. Then we would understand that the differences between us are nothing compared to the spark of light that shines within us all. We are here on this pale blue dot of a planet for only a fleeting moment in time, but we all have the power to make a positive change. If we dig deep within ourselves, we will find the courage of our ancestors to survive adversity and pain. In fact, we are defined by our survival. As a teenager with no family or police support, I was instrumental in shutting down a neo-Nazi terrorist group. I was 18 years old, terrified and faced with death threats, but I knew that I was doing the right thing because I had reclaimed my humanity. So I know that true change is possible. As long as we live and breathe, there is always hope, because hope is intertwined with our DNA, and even in the coldest night, we all have the strength within ourselves to turn darkness into light.